Assalamualaikum. Good afternoon sa inyong lahat. So this afternoon we'll be discussing or sharing with you about our introductory part of our subject, social movements. So there are two prominent features when we talk about social movements or why there is social movements. The first is acceptance of change, then the second, resistance to change. I think you are familiar with this change, the so-called change, the acceptance as well as the resistance. During the time of the campaign in the presidential election, our president now is bringing with him the radical change, pagbabago. And of course, there are a lot of the supporters na who accept this change, but there are also a lot who resisted against the change, especially the so-called radical change. And that's why these are features in which there is the so-called social movement. So the question, why do social movements arise? Or shall we say the origin of social movements? There are also two reasons. The relative deprivation as well as the resource mobilization. What about this relative deprivation? This is the feeling of negative discrepancies between one's own expectation and reality. Then next, an example of this, when people who live in a squatter camps may feel that they are deprived from something, especially those who are poor. And it can be applied also here in our country and also as well as to the other countries, especially that they are deprived with the material things, why they are poor, why they are being marginalized, why they are being oppressed, especially by the elite or by the rich people. Then people must feel that they have the right to their objective, okay? That they deserve better than what they have. Remember yung pabahay program sa mga sundalo at sa mga pulis? Then mayroon doong mga grupo ng mga poor people at kinuha nila because they think that nararapat din sila because they are poor. Okay? Kasi wala namang mga tao doon. Remember kadamay. I think you are familiar with the kadamay. Okay? They are being marginalized, they are poor, yet wala silang bahay. Then here comes the bahay ng mga sundalo at mga mga pulis na wala naman nakatira. So therefore, para sa kain nila, lusubin natin ito. Kasi para yon sa atin. Kaya nga, they have a common perception. Perception needs to exist as a group. So they have a group, the Kadamay group. And that's an example of the movement, that Kadamay. And there are a lot of movements. Okay? Kaya nga, while we journey in our course, I'll give you also topic na i-report ninyo, the international, the national, as well as the local movements. And that will be later kasi assign ko kayo ng iba't ibang movements. Next, another reason is why the social movement arise is the resource mobilization. The resource mobilization. It includes the acquisition and utilization of funds, political influences, media coverage, and personnel. So once again, this resource mobilization includes utilization of funds, political influences, media coverage, and personnel. I think in your mind you have an example of this. How they mobilize the resources, especially to our government. Then these resources must be handled effectively. An issue now na nakalimutan natin is the corruption of PhilHealth. Resource mobilization, saan na napunta? Nawala lang, parang bula, kasi may pandemic pero nawala. And with this pandemic, another naman with yung fund in which politicians ginagamit, nasaan na, paano ginagamit, how they mobilize that resources. Diba may issue yon? Sinovac, less effective mas mahal. Samantalang ang ibang vaccine, ang effectivity is higher, mas mura. Then papaano? Doon tayo sa mahal na less effective. Kita niyo the resource mobilization. That's why may mga move, 'di ba? May mga move na Doke should resign as DOH secretary. So that's an example how they mobilize. That's why people nag-alboroto din. Then as a group grows, the norms are developed, then behavior of members are evaluated, and members must attend the regular meetings, membership fees, recruitment, and the new members, especially if they wanted to form a group para to question on the resource mobilization. And that's the two reasons why social movements arise. So we move on. There are requirements of this effective social movement. First, there must be a specific cause about which the group feels dissatisfied and want to express a dislike. And I think now with the groups now that we have, Akbayan, Anakbayan, etc., Gabriela, Jigo Silang, and the rest, they have the specific cause. Bakit nag-grupo? Because of the dissatisfaction. Then, many people experience a degree of tension about the existing conditions and have a need to propagate. That's another requirement. Then, there must be a high degree of interaction and communication concerning the events. Then, personal values play an important role in this establishment. Then, social movements are more successful if the members have equal status. Then, there must have been previous successful movements which can act as indicators that this movement may succeed. That's according to the study of Dube and Wallace in 1985. So, that was the study. Now, there is another movement daw na hindi pa man klaro itong movement. If you notice, there are resistance and there are also acceptance of that movement, pero hindi pa naklaro everywhere you go around the Philippines or even to the social media. Anong sinasabi doon? Run, 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 Sara. Go, Sara. Run, Sara. For President 2022. Kita ninyo? There are reactions who resisted that and there are also gusto, okay, to that movement. Pero hindi pa rin klarong movement man. I think there is, kung sa Cebuano ba, nagpaluyo. There is behind that movement. I think the rich people. Okay? Then here comes movement, na grupo na rin. Yung mga Dilawan daw. Dilawan, that's also another movement. Maybe established na pero nawawala na sila ngayon. Kasi because na-dominate dito sa kabila. Pero kita ninyo, so this movement now, the requirements maybe na attain nila yung requirements. So yun yung subaybayan natin. Especially yung bagong lumabas ngayon, the Run Run Go Go Sara for the President 2022. Next, there are 4 ways which movements or the social movements can be resisted. Pwedeng mag-resist. Kaya nga sabi na 2 dominant features, sabi natin, pwedeng acceptance, pwede namang resistance. But there are 4 ways daw that this social movement can be resisted. First is the ridicule. Making a social movement look ridiculous in the eyes of the world. Like women's liberation. Although we have the women's movement, pwede yan i-report ninyo, but that's anyway, yung ridicule. Hindi yan tama yan. Like sa amin ngayon, because of this women empowerment in the Catholic Church, may mga grupo din ng kababaihan na gustong magiging pari. So, pwedeng i-resist yun. Because in our tradition, in my belief, it's a big no-no na magiging pari sila. Ano na yung tawag sa kanya? Hindi na pari, baka mari. Okay? Kasi babae man. So, yan. Ridicule. That's a resistance. Kung magkatotoo man yun, like the other Protestant group na mayroon na silang ordained women na they act as a priest, or I don't know anong tawag, a reverend, or what they call it. Basta yun, resistance, ridicule. Then, pwede na rin itong another ways in which we can that social movement can be resisted, cooperation. If you can't beat them, join them. Maybe pretentious, if you are not with them, or furthering, you can join them. So that's cooperation. So once again, if you can't beat them, hindi mo siya matalo, join them na lang. Pero kung magre-resist ka, do not join them. Okay? Then another thing is the formal social control. When movements are declared as undesirable and it becomes ban. May mga na-ban din. Is si CPP-NPA a movement? What do you think? And yes, that's a movement. Then, na-ban sila ngayon? Na-ban ba sila? So, that's more on formal social movement when the movements are declared as undesirable and it becomes ban. Sabi nga, why recruit the young people, the young students? Sa iba't ibang, kaya nga may mga ibang university din na nabantaan. May mga police UP, UST, I think Ateneo nakasali, Lasal. Kaya ba't? Yun ha, yun. Formal na pwedeng i-ban sila, yung grupo na yun. Or another one is the so-called, ito mga fraternity. There are fraternities naman na nakalink doon sa kaliwa. So, binaban din sila sa school. So, that's another way. Then, next is force. Force. If all results fail, the police, army are called to stop the movement. That's according to the study of Schiffer and Lam in 1995. So once again, this force, if all resorts fail, the police or the army are called to stop the movement. In Hong Kong, noon, di ba, young people pumupunta doon, sila yon nagpuprotesta. Pero what happened? Na-stop sila by the police and by the military. Sa atin, may movement din during the EDSA Revolution. That's February 24. Okay? The EDSA Revolution. So, may panawagan, nagkaisa ng tao, the characteristic of the social movement, nabuo sila, but that's unbloody revolution. Pero, kung ginamitan yung by force ng military, buti na lang, hindi nangyari. And why? Because of fasting and prayer of the people, and we can call it a miracle. That's unbloody revolution. Na pwede yung gawin itong by force na paalisin yung mga tao doon, pero hindi naman nangyari. So, those are the four ways of the so-called social movements that pwedeng magre-resist. Then there are characteristics of the so-called social movement. First, expresses the dissatisfaction of people. Then, members of the movement expect that something will be done about the matter. Then, some social movement are highly organized, in which ang dami na. Kaya nga yung i-report natin yun ng mga movements which are highly organized. Then, group of people feel very strongly about the matter. Then, the propaganda, when public attention is being drawn to matters, then influences about public opinion, then have a potential to bring about social change. That's why social change, social movement, they can pariente or first cousin. Anyway, for the peace major, you have the subject about social change, so we'll not dwell on that, pero medyo pariente yan sila, first cousin yan sila. But since you have the subject, we don't dwell that talagang i-elaborate natin. Then, may transform the society. Then, potential strength should be over or underestimated. So, those are the characteristics of the so-called social movement. Then, what about the types? So, there are a lot of types. It depends on the author of this social movement. So, marami yan sila ha. Pero yung ating mabanggit dito, maaring madagdagan ninyo yan in your research, but there are a lot of movements. Pero yun nandito lang, yun na yung nadagdag na research ko na maaari ding dagdagan. So, the first type of social movement, according to my research, is the redemptive movements. What about these redemptive movements? Are usually religious in nature, which do not attempt to change society, but especially target change in people. Kuha natin redemptive movement. It usually these are religious in nature, which do not attempt to change the society, but specifically target the change in the people. I'd like to cite an example of this redemptive movement. We know very well, wherever we go, our history would tell us that when they talk about Christianity, in the mind of the majority, when they talk Christianity, only the Catholics are Christians. But nowadays, especially when Protestantism came, especially in your history, the period of Reformation, anong ginawa? Naitsapwera kaming Katoliko because we are not Christians. Kita ninyo? They don't want to change the society but to the specific, to the people. Sinasabihan kami, kawawa naman kayong mga Katoliko. Itatapon kayo sa dakat-dakatang apoy. Kasi that's written in the Bible. Mali ang turo ninyo. Naniwala kayo sa rebolto. Sinamban nyo ang rebolto. So, ang mga teachings namin, sinisira nila lahat. They want to change the people. Kasi kawawa kami. Nagets ninyo? That's more on redemptive. Gusto nilang iligtas ka sa kamahapakan. Kasi kami punta sa dagat-dagatang apoy, sila gusto sa kaharian. Okay? Same is true with the other world. In the Islamic world, marami din. Diba? There are a lot of factions. Now, may ideologies. Yung ideology nila, the extremists, I think this is the study of Dr. Shan. Yes, alam niya ito. Gustong iligtas ang iba. Dapat, if you are with us, if you're against us, you'll be killed. So that's why, join us para sigurado mapunta kayo sa heaven and you will be salubungin ng 72 virgins. Kita niyo yung ideology na yan? They don't want to change maybe the society, but the people in itself. Okay, that's more redemptive kasi religious by nature, using religion in order na makaakay ng mga tao. Second, types of movement is alternative movements. 6 total change among individuals. Ito, total change among individuals. An example are students, the organization, the civic organization, non-government organization, or the government organization campaigning to people, especially the young ones, steer clear of prohibited drugs. Ayan. Sabi ni Duterte, war on drugs. Anong sabi? I hate drugs. Okay? So, that's more. May alternative, akayin na yung mga bata o maaring pwedeng maturuan yung mga bata para humiwalay doon, especially yung kasamaan. The organization, the students, NGO, LGO, etc., etc. That's an alternative movement. Dito tayo para mawala yung, hindi kayo pariwara, mabago yung direction, ito yung gawin natin. Kaya nga, Duterte also has the project or the program of Tukhang. And this tukhang, kinakausap, then ganito, i-rehabilitate. So, ang ganda naman. But until today, marami pa rin. Okay, pero alternative, so yun, alam natin from the word alternative, para mapalayo doon, so dapat may gawin dito. The students, young people, the organization. Okay. Pero ngayon, ay may nagawa ba? May rehabilitation test center? Mayroon naman, pero ayaw pumasok yung iba. Kaya nga, well, that's the problem in our society. But that's more on alternative kung merong ibibigay para hindi siya mapariwara, hindi siya mapunta sa masamang landas. Next, the third, reformative movement. Aim to change not only one's behavior, but also the behavior of the whole society, These are nationally organized efforts to change the norms of society. And what are these movements? I think from your report, pwede kayong makapili yung changing the behaviors of the society kasi highly organized na itong movement o reformative. Okay? Then, another thing. We have the reformative pero mas malalim itong isa. Number 5, transformative movements. Work for total change of the society. Pag total change, ito yung radical change. Okay? Radical change. Sabi, maraming problema sa Pilipinas. So, pagkatapos ito, dapat matransform na. Wala ng droga. Wala ng korupsyon. Matransform na lahat. Pero itong idea and the action, dapat may movement talaga. And this movement, dapat akayin yung lahat ng mga government actors na mag-transform din, mag-level up. Okay? Like the police officers, the PNP organization, the military. Sila dapat manguna mag-transform. But until today, there are still a lot yung grupo nila na mga scalawags. Okay? There are a lot na wala pa rin parang nawawala pa rin sa kanilang grupo, sa kanilang organisasyon. Number 5, regressive or reactionary movements. Then have their aim of setting back the clock. Itong regressive or reactionary. Members view certain social changes with suspicion and distance and try to reverse the current trends in the society. So, anong maisip ninyo ng movement ngayon? Okay, reactionary. So, mayroon kayo sa isip. And I think mayroon kayo sa isip. Oh. Members view certain social change with suspicion, distaste, and try to reverse current trends in the society. So, mayroon, reactionary. Especially now, in our present organization, marami. Yung iba, hindi pa nagsasalita dahil takot. Okay? Kasi buweltahan ka. Buweltahan ka. Pero alam nyo kung sino-sino yung mga grupo, yung regressive or reactionary movements. Meron yan. Okay. The next is reform or revisionary movements. Parang it's the opposite of the reactionary. Ito no, reform of revisionary movements naman. Believe that certain changes in the specific areas of society are necessary but still satisfied with the existing order. Ang ganda naman, no? Believe that certain changes in a specific society, areas of society are necessary but still satisfied with the existing order. And I think in your mind, you have also an idea who are this movement o yung mga grupo na ito, yung movement na ito, yung the reform. From the religious aspect, mayroon din akong example dito which is also the reform. Like for me and my other co-members, I am one of the members of the reform group. From our order, by nature is religious. So first, I think you hear the word yung the order or the group of the order of the Carmelites, tawag lang OCARM. But on the 16th century, our foundress, Mother Teresa, also nagre-reform. Hindi naman kami totally umalis sa order, but a reform one. Okay? Kaya nga, we are still satisfied with the existing order. So, kaya nga, ang tawag sa amin kay reform, sila Calds Carmelite, kami Discalds Carmelite. So, but we are the same. We are Carmelites. So, may mga reform lang tawag sa amin. Kay reformist group kami. Okay. Sige. Then, revolutionary, from the word revolutionary, alam na alam niyo yan, are deeply dissatisfied with the existing social order and work for radical change that are tailored to their ideological beliefs. Ang dami, may grupo tayo, daming grupo na revolutionary group using force for a change. Ang dami. Diba? Si PPNPA, the rest of the group. In Mindanao, mayroon din tayo. Buti lamang nag-usap kasi revolution, we have to change. Radical change. Then, next, number 8. Utopian movement refers to the members' vision for radical change and blissful life. Radical change dito. Ganon, change din ito. Radical change and blissful life. They want a happy life. Okay? Either on a large scale, sometimes in the future, or in a small scale at the present. Several contemporary religious cults are example of utopian movements. Ayan, may mga kulto. Kasi if you want to go to heaven, if you want to have an eternal life, join us more on the cult. And we have a lot of that, especially in the Christian world. Mga kulto, sino-sino mga kulto? Can you cite one? And I think in your mind you have. An example of this dito sa Pilipinas, si Incleo, yung PBMA, the Philippine Missionary Benevolent Association. So, if it is a cult, mayroon silang supreme, mayroon silang sinusunod ang tao. What about the rest, mga kulto? What about si Kebs? Stop! Can we consider that group, that movement, or that religious? Yes, and why? Kasi, kayo lang maligtas. You'll experience eternal, yung the blissful life. Total surrender. Kita, utopian. Yun yung word, utopian. Yung dapat happy ka. In a short term or a long term, basta what is important, you're happy. You'll be blissful. Eternal happiness. Or the great gratuitous happiness. So, yun yun, more on that movement. Na, sabi nga, sa mga kulto, kasi instant, join us, and you'll be happy, and you'll be saved. Next is escapist or retreatist movement. Now, from the word escape or retreat, withdrawal. So, this movement do not seek to change the society, but withdrawn from it, and not to experience corruption. Certain religious sects are example of the type of the movement where the group of members isolate themselves from contact with the outsiders. Escapist, contact from the outsiders. Sa amin, I'll cite you an example. Although we have the community sa amin sa Discalced Carmelite, yung mga monk, we have also the monk. The monk, not totally nag-escape naman sila sa outside world, but they live. I'll cite you an example. Sa amin yung mga mongha namin in front of SM Lanang, I think lahat tayo nakapunta sa Lanang, meron malaking cross doon. Kita ninyo, yun yung aming monastery sa kababaihan. Yung nasa loob talaga. They work there, they pray there. When they died, they ordained, and hindi sila pwedeng sa labas o makalabas. Kung lalabas man sila, ilipat ng ibang community, okay lang. But pag ilipat sila, doon pa rin sila sa loob. So, the retreat, they withdrawn from the society. So, kaya nga, example dito, this is a movement where the group of members isolate themselves from the contact with the outsiders. Kaya nga doon sa may mga paryente siguro kayo, yung may Kristiyano sa inyo o may kilala kayo, when you go to our monastery doon, hindi basta-basta makausap yung mga nasa loob. So another monastery sa kababaihan din, yung Pink Sister, the Sister of the Holy Spirit, mayroon din doon sa Davao, kung nakapunta na kayo. Especially mga Kristiyano, I think you're familiar with that. So yan. They withdrawn from the outside world and hindi basta-basta makapag-usap sa mga tao sa inside world. But, iba naman yung usapan. But this is more an example of this. Okay? Then, the next is the expressive social movement. From the word expressive, this aim to change the psychological, emotional, social movement of their individual members. The basic form of the experience of the expressive movements are religious movement and fashion movements which do not aim to change the world but give the members opportunity to encourage in a ceremonial and related behavior so that the inner feelings can be satisfactorily expressed. So, more on religious yung expressive social movement. If you notice, kadami-dami na sinasabi, nasa more on the religious, the cults and the rest. Ito naman expressive, more on religious din ang expressive movements. Then other important social movements also. I think we're familiar with globalization. Another term of globalization, in your reading siguro, parang a borderless world. Borderless world, yung globalization. Habang usapin din yung globalization, maybe one of the topic, magsishare ako sa inyo, more on globalization. Maybe later, siguro magre-record din ako about globalization before your report or after, nagre-report kayo, mag-insert lang ako. Okay. Then breaking down the national barriers so that nations can interact freely with each other. That's why we call it the borderless world. Why? One of the features of globalization, itong the modern technology. Kasi noon, tingnan nyo, pag magsulat ka, it will take months or even years to communicate America. But nowadays, borderless, harap-harapan, makausap mo ang sinong gusto mong makausap sa malayong lugar. Borderless world. That includes technology, that includes political system, that includes also the banking system. Okay? And that also includes the barter trade. Okay? The global, yung tanatawag global bazaar. So, yun. That's all about globalization. Okay? Then, second, another movements is the women's movements women claim the rights as men. Marami tayo dyan. Mga grupo-grupo. Sabi ko, Gabriela, etc., etc. Okay? Tsaka siguro may mag-report sa inyo dyan. Then, industrialization, introduction of power machines and the factory in the manufacture goods. So, yan, that's more industrialization, di ba? In our history, di ba, hinay-hinay. At hanggang ngayon, okay na sa industrialization, more on the factory and in the manufacture goods. Then, what about the so-called social movements? What is social movements? There are a lot of definitions of the social movements depending on the authors, on sino yung nagsasalita. Kaya nga sinasabi na there is no single consensus definition of the word social movement. Pero we'll just mention some. Okay? According to Mario Dayang, he argues that nearly all definitions share three criteria, according to Mario. A network of informational interactions between popularity of individuals, group or organization engaged in a political or a cultural conflict on the basis of a shared collective identity. So once again, itong sabi niyang the three criteria, a network of informational interaction of the plurality or of the individuals then to the groups or organizations. Second, then they are engaged also in political or cultural conflict. This is the basis of the collective identity, that social movement, according to Mario Dayan. Then another sociologist by the name of Charles Tilly, he defines social movement as the series of continuous performances displayed or displays campaigns by which ordinary people make collective claims on others. Okay. Series of continuous performances, displays, campaigns, so yan, collective claims on each other. Then social movements, for him, are major vehicles for ordinary people's participation in public politics. So that's according to Telly. Okay? That's a participation of ordinary people in a political politics. Parang election, no? That we have to exercise our right of suffrage so that we can participate and we choose leaders. Okay? So that's public participation of the ordinary people. Another definition according to Taro, he defines social movements as a collective challenges to the elites, the authorities, and other groups of cultural codes by people with common purposes and solidarity in a sustained interactions with the elites, opponents, and authorities. He specifically distinguishes social movements from political parties and advocacy group. So, iba daw ang politics or advocacy. Ito talaga, sabi niya, ang social movement, you have the common purpose and solidarity with your interaction with the elite, the opponents, as well as the authorities. Then another sociologist by the name of John McCarthy as well as Mayer Zaud, they define social movements as a set of opinions and beliefs in a population which represents preferences for changing some elements of social structure in or a reward distribution of the society. If you notice, all the definitions, they are interrelated. Pero once again wala talagang consensus definition. It depends to the author, it depends to the context as well as to the situation. Okay? Kaya nga tayo, as an ordinary citizen, after knowing this, we can also formulate our own definition. Then, kung may libro tayo, may isulat natin, copyright akin yon. Like what they did itong iba't ibang definition. Okay, so we move on. Sabi ko nga, no consensus definition, ang dami-daming mga nagsasabi. It depends to the situation and also to the idea of the different authors. So may mga arguments din about si Tilly, sabi niya kanina, there are three major elements of the social movement according to Tilly. Ano kaya itong name ni Tilly? Si Charles Tilly. Tilay? Tiley o Tilly. Okay? Binisaya no Tilly. Tilay. Doksyan, our Americano here, Tilly, Tilay. Ikaw na bahala dyan. Okay. Anong sabi niya? He argues three major elements of social movement. First is the campaign, according to Tilly. Campaigns are sustained or organized public efforts making collective claims of target authorities. I think we understand that one from the word campaigns. Okay? Then second, the repertoire or repertoire of contention. Tama bang the pronunciation, Doki? Repertoire. By the way, your classmate, Doc, okay lang ha, ipahambog kita. Doc Shan Abdul Wahid is a medical doctor. He is now taking up na classmate ninyo ng Peace and Development. His major is Peace and Development. That's why palagi kong sinasabi kasi okay lang daw ka, sikreto mo that he is also an American citizen. Nasa Amerika yan sila naninirahan pero originally dito sila sa atin sa Pilipinas. Kaya nga, Doc, pasensya, na-revealed natin ang iyong sikreto but well, wala namang problema siguro dyan. Kaya nga, okay ba? The pronunciation, repertoire. Okay? Employment of combinations from among the following forms of political action, the creation of special purpose associations and coalitions, public meetings, solemn procession, the vigils, the rallies, demonstration, petition, the drives, statement to and in public media, and pamphleteering. So, yun yung tinatawag yung repertoire of contention. Kita ninyo, parang itong the three major elements, according to Tilly, magkaugnay-ugnay sila. Then, the wonk or the wonk display. Ano itong wonk? Worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment. Wonk display. According to Tilly, itong elements na ito. Participants, concerted public representation of worthiness, yun yung W. Unity, ang U. Numbers, ang N. At saka commitment, yung C. On the part of themselves and or their constituencies. So, yun, wonk display. So, those are the arguments of Tilly when we talk about social movement. Okay, medyo ina-elaborate niya. Okay, we move on. So, what about the history of this social movement? So, basahin na lang natin. In the early growth of social movement was connected to broad economic and political changes in England and in the mid-18th century, including political representation, market capitalization, and proletarianizations. So, it started in England, particularly on the 18th century, according to the study of bringing. Okay? Then, the first mass social movement catalyzed around the controversial political figure, si John Wilkes, an editor of one of the paper in the North Britain. Then Wilkes vigorously attacked the new administration of Lord Bute and a peace term that the new government accepted at 1763 Treaty of Paris at the end of the Seventh Years' War. So, gira-gira sila noong Seventh War, kaya umusbong ito ngayon nag-against sa kanilang government. Then, other political movements that emerged in the 18th century included the British abolitionist movement against slavery, becoming one between the sugar boycott of 1791 and the Second Great Petition Drive in 1806, and possibly the upheaval surrounding a French and American Revolution. So once again, itong social movement, medyo matagal-tagal na. Once again, it started on the 18th century. Because of that sitwasyon nila, so nagkaroon ng movement. Then other political movements that emerged in the late 18th century included the British abolitionist movement against slavery. Between, ayan, sinabi na natin yan, the boycott of 1791, the Second Great Petition Drive in 1806, particularly in the French and American Revolutions. So during those times, those who are historians here are familiar with that, na talagang ang hirap during that time. That's why these social movements nag-a-arise. Okay? Then the growth and the spread of social movement. From 1815, Britain, after the victory of the Napoleonic Wars, entered a period of social upheaval characterized by the growing maturity of the use of social movements and special interest associations. Chartism was the first mass movement of the growing working class in the world. I don't know in your history if you still remember yung Chartism. Then, the term social movements was introduced in 1850, so 1850, by the German sociologist Lorenz von Stein. So, take note on that, ha? It started, the one who introduced in 1850, a sociologist, a German sociologist by the name of Lorenz von Stein. And in his book, History of the French Social Movement from 1789 to the present, 1850. So siya talaga yung nag-umpisa, nag-introduce yung the term social movement. Then, the labor movement and the socialist movement in the 19th century, so from 18 to 19, nandun naman yung labor as well as socialist movement, are seen as the prototypical social movements leading to the formation of the communist and the social democratic parties and organizations. These tendencies were seen in poorer countries as pressure for the reform continued. For example, in Russia, with the Russian Revolution in 1905 and of 1917, resulting the collapse of the Tsarist regime around the end of the First World War. That's in 19th century. Then in 1945, Britain, after the victory of the Second World War, entered a period of radical reform and change. In the post-war period, women's rights, gays' rights, peace, civil rights, anti-nuclear and environment movement emerged after the dub of the New York New Social Movement. So yon, ang dami-dami na nag-umpisa from 18th century to 19th century. 19th century, sabi ko nga, because of that situation, nag-a-arise yung iba't ibang mga movements. The methods of work with the social movements. Meron tayong tinatawag na the peaceful movements. Various movements which are non-violent means of protest as part of the campaign of non-violent resistance all often called the civil resistance. The American Civil Rights Movement, the Polish Solidarity Movement of the Nonviolent, the civil disobedience-oriented wing of the Indian independence movement would fall into this category. Then we have also the so-called the violent movements, the various movements which resort to violence. They are usually armed, and the extreme cases can take form of a paramilitary or a terrorist organization. Ayan, sa atin, before, nangyayari na. Ngayon, nangyayari na at the present time. But started before. So, yun yung the methods kung paano nangyayari itong the positive or the peaceful as well as the violent movements. Then, we have also the so-called the old and the new movements. These movements for change have existed in many centuries. Most of the oldest organized movements dating in the 18th and 19th century fought a specific social groups such as the working class, the peasant, the whites, the aristocrats, the Protestants. Then they were usually centered on some materialistic goals like improving the standard of living or for example, the political autonomy of the working class. Then the new movements are movements which became dominant from the second half of the 20th century. So you look at the gradual change, 18, 19, ngayon 28th century. Like the feminist movement, siguro isa yan sa report ninyo, the pro-choice movement, the civil rights movements, the environmental movements, the free software movements, the gay rights movement, peace movement, the anti-nuclear movement, after the alter globalization movement, etc., etc. Sometimes they are known as the new social movement. They are usually centered on the issues that go beyond but are not separate from class. So kaya nga, later I will assign you, so we'll focus more on this social and the new movements. Okay, ako na lang bahala mag-assign ha, hindi kayo pipili. Akong pipili, I'll assign you of course for your report. And of course, your report, ang ganda, it can be magbibigay ko siguro oral, kagaya sa ginagawa ko, maybe a recorded reporting, pwede naman siguro, o kung gusto niyo mag-online using the Google Meet, wala namang problema, pero may problema tayo because of this internet interruption. Okay, may problema talaga sa net. Okay, nasubukan ko na ito since last semester. May time na okay, pero may time na wala talaga. Sa undergrad, sinubukan ko to, ganun din. Kaya in the previous semester, yung iba, nagre-record ako. Minsan may mga module or may mga articles sinisend, then in return, sasagot kayo. Yun yung output na ibibigay nyo. And of course, we have our final examination. So yun ha, expect for sa reporting. 10 man kayo, then yung dalawa yata is re-enroll lang, siguro 8 kayong magre-report. So I'll give you topic. Then, the identification of the supporters of this social movement, we have the so-called the insiders and the outsiders. What about these insiders? Often exaggerate the level of support by considering people supporters whose level of activity or support is weak, but also reject those that outsiders might consider supporters because they discredit the cause or are even seen as adversaries. So, yun yung the insiders. Then, what about the outsiders, supporters? Those not supporters who may tend either underestimate or over-underestimate the level of or support or activity of elements of a movement, but including or excluding those that insiders would exclude or include. So, medyo nagsinumbagay na insider at saka outsider supporters, no? If you look at the definition. Then there are two dimensions on the definition of the social movements that exclude some expression the socio-political behaviors. First, take note on this. Social movements must have the capacity to mobilize its membership. Look at mobilize its membership. So that's the two dimensions to the definitions of the social movement. Then the second is mobilization must be sustained over a period of time. So, ang clue dyan sa word, una, mobilize the membership. Next, the second is the sustainability. Then, over a period of time. So, those are the two dimensions of the definitions of the social movement that exclude some expressions of the socio-political behaviors. Then we have the term interest group and the social movement. So what's the difference between the two of this interest group? Are they related? Are they interrelated? So the interest group also comprise a set of collective actors, and they are quite similar to social movement. So my similarity is quite similar. And there are also differences. Pariente, first cousin, second cousin, magkadugo. There are similarities, there are differences. So, ano itong similarities and differences? The interest group are defined in a relation to the government, to polity, whereas interests of social movement extend well beyond the polity of other institutional spheres. So, yun yung pagkakaiba sa pagkapareho. Then, interest group are generally embedded within the political arena, as most are regarded as legitimate factors within it, while the social movement are on the other hand, typically outside of the polity. Okay? Sige. The third is interest group pursue their collective behaviors mainly through the institutionalized means, whereas the social movements pursue their ends mainly via the use of non-institutional means, conducting marches, boycotts, sit-ins, etc., etc. So, yun yung pagkakaiba. Institutionalist ang isa, yung isa non-institutional. Then, how social movement and the interest group or other collective groups overlap. So, nag-overlap pa. Then, each of them can arise spontaneously and can result from prior planning, negotiations, organizations, even crowd when sponsored and organized by social movement. Social movement and interest group can form an alliance to press their joint interests together. Then, as some social movement develop over time, they often become more and more institutionalized, with some of the evolving into interest groups or even parties. Then, what about the chains? All definitions of social movements reflect upon that social movements are integrally related to social change. So, yung sabi ko kanina, social change, they are related with social movements, pero will not dwell more on social change, especially to the peace majors here because of the subject on social change. So, they do not encompass the activities of people as members of stable social groups with established and questioned structures, norms, and values. The behavior of members of the social movements does not reflect the assumptions that the social order will continue essentially as it is. Then, especially modern social movement assume the possibility of steering history into a specific directions. What the direction does not matter in this instance. What matters is the direction itself. It reflects instead the faith that people collectively can bring about or prevent social change if they will dedicate themselves to the pursuit of the goal. Uncommitted observers may regard these goals as illusions, but to the members, they are hopes that are quite capable of realization. Then asked about his activities, the member of the social movement would not reply, I do this because it has always been done, or it's just the custom. He is always aware that his behavior is influenced by the goal of the movement. And ano yung goal? To bring about a change in a way things have always been done, or sometimes to prevent such change from coming aboard. So, yun yung goal ng movement. Then, what about the interaction? We know the very different kinds of possible collective behaviors, like crowd for instance. But collective behaviors in crowd, panics, the elementary forms like milling, are of brief duration or episodic and are guided largely by the impulse. They don't constitute a social movement as they don't create internal bonds among its participants that is necessary for sustaining the so-called social movements. Then a movement is not merely a perpetuated crowd, since a crowd does not possess organizational and motivational mechanisms capable of sustaining membership through periods of inaction and waiting. Furthermore, crowd's mechanism cannot be used to achieve communication and coordination of activity over a wide area, such as a nation or a continent. But when short-lived impulses give way to a long-term aims, and when sustained association takes the place of situational groupings of people, the result is the so-called social movement. Then there are areas which the social movement operates. We can identify, according to guidance, another author, 4 areas in which social movements operate in the modern society. First, take note on this, the democratic movements that work for political rights. So that's democratic. Then second, the labor movements that work for the control of the workplace. The next is the ecological movements that are concerned with the environment. Then another is the peace movement that work toward well and peace. So siguro may i-assign ako sa inyo dito kasi ito yung social movement kung saan nag-ooperate in the modern societies. Okay? By the way once again, our report, international. We'll start international, then later, pwedeng local. Depende kung anong topic ina-assign ko sa inyo. Pero in my mind now, ang maunang reporter sa wala pabor-pabor, Dukshan ikaw unang magre-report kasi more on America, doon tayo sa Amerika muna, since you're American citizen, so alam na alam mo ito. Okay lang, Doki? Huwag kang magalit sa akin kasi pinahambog kita But I salute you, doktor. Okay? Kasi biro mo yan, doktor ka na, nag-doktor ka pa ng PhD. Kaya nga, hinahangaan kita, Doki. Hindi yan alam ng iba, at least alam na nila ngayon sa classmate mo. Anyway, group chat lang man ito. Okay. Next, the types of social movements we can describe according to Aberli, another author, the 4 types of social movements according to him. That's why I told you there are a lot of types of the movement. Nagdepende yan sa author, kung sino yung author. Ito naman si Aberli, sabi naman, there are 4 types naman. And based upon the 2 characteristics, who is the movement attempting the change and how much the change is being advocated. So, yun yung according to him, the characteristics. So, ito yung sabi niya, the 4 types, the alternative, nasabi na natin, the redemptive, the revolutionary, and the reformative, in which we explained that in the previous slides. So, ito yung sabi ni Aberli naman, yung 4 na yan. Then, the social movements, there are different stages. So, look at the stages of the social movement. Paano ito nag-arise sa stages nila? Then, the social movements often pass through. The movements emerge. The word is emerge for a variety of reasons. Then, coalesce, the second, and generally bureaucratize, the third. Then, at the point, they can take a number of paths, including finding some form of the movement, success, then failure, co-optation of leaders, then repression by the larger groups, and that is and in the government, or even the establishment of movement within the mainstream. So, yun yung the stages of the social movement. So, may ano dito, yung diagram. Yan, the stage of social movement. Emerge, coalesce, then bureaucratize, then after that, under that bureaucracy, may success, may failure, cooptation, repression, or go mainstream. Then, pwedeng mag-decline din yang under sa bureaucratize. That's adapted from Bloomer in his research. And of course, si Tilly nandyan pa rin. Then there are theoretical perspective when we talk about social movements. The serious theories of social movements are based on the general approaches to the principles of society's development. So these are the theories. I think there are 6 theories of the social movement. Collective behavior, the mass society approach, the deprivation theory, the resource mobilization, the political processes, the new social movements, in which some of them natalakay na natin, pero siguro fast track natin. So, there are 2 significant problems with the theory. So, yung 6 may problem daw. First, since most people feel deprived on one level or another almost at all time, the theory has hard time explaining why the groups that form social movements do when other people are also deprived. Then second, the reasoning behind this theory is circular. Often, the only evidence for deprivation is the social movement. If deprivation is claimed to be the cause, but the only evidence for such is a movement, the reasoning is circular. So, ikot-ikot lang daw. So, yun yung isa sa mga problema ng social movement theory. So, ito na yung collective behavior theory, or it is also known as the structural change theory. So, the supporters of this approach consider social movement as semi-rational responses to abnormal conditions of structural strain between the major societal institutions. That strain causes malfunctioning of the whole social system. So, structural strain theory. Now, the theory proposes 6 factors that encourage social movement development according to the study of Schmeiser. So, yun yung theory na behavioral, yan, collective behavior theory or the structural strain theory. So, there are 6 proposes 6 factors. Una, the structural conduciveness. People come to believe their society as a problem. Yun yung structural conduciveness. Second, structural strain. People experience deprivation. That's structural change. Third, growth and spread of solution. So a solution to the problems people are experiencing is proposed and spread. That's a proposed factors of the theory of structural strain theory. Fourth, precipitating factors. Discontent usually requires catalyst, often a specific event, to turn it into a social movement. Then the fifth, the lack of social control. The identity that is to be changed must be at least somewhat often to the change. If the social movement is quickly and powerfully repressed, it may never materialize. That's number 5. Lack of social control. Then the last factor of the theory of social strain is mobilization. This is the actual organizing and active component of the movement. People do what needs to be done. So yun yung the factors, the proposed factors of the structural strain theory. So we move forward to the next theory, the mass society approach or deprivation theory. So this theory are close to the approach collective behavior, but there are some differences. So, medyo lapit sila sa unang nabanggit natin, pero may diferensya daw. So, the deprivation theory argues that the social movements have their foundation among people who feel deprived of some goods or resources. According to this approach, individuals who are lacking some good, service, or comfort are more likely to organize a social movement to improve or defend their conditions. It adds to the collective behavior approach that social movement is a mild, aborted, weak, undeveloped form a revolutionary outbreak or an aspect of revolution. The next, number three theory, the mass societal theory, argues that the social movement are made up of individuals in large societies who feel insignificant or socially detached. Social movements, according to this theory, provide a sense of empowerment and belonging to the movement members would otherwise not have. A very little support has been found in the theory now. Next, according to this position, the normal or healthy society is characterized by strong class and group solidarities, which play the controlling function and prevent the manipulation of the people. But when this class or group solidarity becomes weak under the conditions of industrialization and urbanization, the processes of massification or the anomy or attenuation or ruthlessness begin. These uprooted and atomized masses become vulnerable to direct mobilizing appeals by the powerful elites and the charismatic leaders. Then the fourth theory of the social movement theory is the resource mobilization. Emphasizes the importance of resources of the social movement development and success. Resources are understood here to include knowledge, money, media, labor, solidarity, legitimacy, the internal and external support from the power elite, and the theory argues that social movements develop when individuals with grievances are able to mobilize sufficient resources to take action. The emphasis on the resources offers an explanation why some discontentment and deprived individuals are able to organize while others are not. So that's all about the so-called the resource mobilization theory. But in this theory, the resource mobilization, may mga assumptions din. And what are those assumptions? There will always be a grounds for protests in modern, politically pluralistic societies because there is an constant discontentment. Yon, discontentment, grievances or deprivation. And this, emphasizes the importance of these factors as it makes them ambiguous. Then second assumption, actors are rationally the way and benefits from the movement participation. So another assumption, members are recruited through networks. Commitment is maintained by the building of a collective identity and a continuing to nurture interpersonal relationship. Then the next is movement organization is contingent upon the aggression of the resources. So we move on kasi marami yan, mga assumptions. So dito na tayo sa political process theory. From the word itself, alam natin itong political process theory. Is similar to resource mobilization in many regards, but tends to emphasize a different component of social structures that is important for social movement, political opportunities. Then political process Also, political process theory argues that there are three vital components for the movement formation. So itong political, take note the three vital components. The insurgent consciousness, the organizational strength, and the political opportunities. Then, the next is, the next theory of social movement, the cultural theory. Cultural theory builds upon both political process and the resource mobilization theories, but extend them in two ways. So there are two ways of the cultural theory. It emphasizes the importance of the movement culture, then it attempts to address the free rider problem. What about this free rider problem? The free rider problem refers to the idea that people will not be motivated to participate in a social movement that will use up their personal resources. And I think maintindihan natin yon. Personal resources, that's money, and that's their time. And maybe that's also their talents. Then, if they can still receive the benefits without participating. In other words, if a person X knows that movement Y is working to improve environmental conditions in his neighborhood, he is presented with a choice, join or not join the movement. So, yun yung free rider. Nagdepende talaga. Kaya nga, free rider. Nagamit ko to, so parang gamitan siya. Then, if he believes that the movement will succeed without him, he can avoid participation in the movement, save his resources, and still reap the benefits. This is a free riding. Significant problem for social movement theory has been to explain why people join the movement if they believe the movement can and will succeed without their contribution. So, yun yung problema sa free rider. Maro-maro. Kahit hindi ako magbigay ng resources ko, my time, my money, and everything, kung successful yan, doon ako. Ayan, a free rider. Maro, switik. Then, cultural theory argues that in conjunction with the social networks being an important contact tool, the injustice frame will provide the motivation for people to contribute to the movement. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for this lecture. Medyo matagal, saka nakapagod din magdaldal mag-isa. Maganda sana kung face-to-face ito. So while discussing, nagdadaldal ako, nagtatanong, dadaldal, brighter ano sana. But because of the pandemic, so ganito lang munang gawin natin na I hope learn something. Then by the next meeting siguro, I'll have my other topic, maybe globalization or the rest. Then in our group chat, I'll give each one of you a topic. Maring tagdalawang topic or isang topic, nagdepende yan kung gaano kalawak yung topic mo. Pero sinabi ko kanina, huwag magalit Dukshan ha, kasi ikaw lang man yata kilala ko dito at saka yung nag-retake sa course, nag-re-enroll, and the rest mga education student or may public ad yata na classmate kayo. So ang maunang reporter, hindi muna agad-agad kasi I'll give you time also to research. So it's up to you with your report. It's up to you. Kung mag-Google Meet tayo o recorded, yung iba nga during the report, you just send the materials. Then sa mga reporters, ganito ang gawin ninyo ha. Please prepare at least 3 questions. 3 questions na sasagutin ng mga classmate ninyo for the output para may basihan din ako kung mabigyan ba kayo ng 1 or 125 or 2. Depende yan kasi pag mag-rely lang ako sa exam, pwede naman pero mayroon tayong reporting at of course isa lang exam natin is a final exam. And of course, online pa rin siya kaya wala pa mang face-to-face. So I'll just send that exam. Then right after this, siguro I'll give you in our group chat mga 3 tanong din, 3 questions din about social movement. So ang dami na nating natalakay, kung baga yun yung overview lahat sa ating social movement. Then from that, magbibigay tayo ng mga topic sa inyo, specific na. Parang an application of all the movements that we mentioned during this recorded lecture. So, pasensya na po kayo. Dukshan, huwag magalita, pasensya. Kasi ikaw lang kilala ko sa grupo and the rest, at least makilala ka din. Kaya na, I salute you, Dukshan. So, with that, thank you very much and God bless you all. Mabuhay tayong lahat.